Hello, Chris. How are you?
I'm all right, thank you. Yeah, not too bad. A bit windswept and wild today. I've just come back from site, so I don't know what it's like wherever you guys are, but it's lashing with rain, and yeah, everything is just horizontal right now.
Yeah, it's pretty. I mean, I'm down in Hampshire, and it's windy, 50,
Yeah,
60 mile an hour. Yeah, not
yeah.
too bad on the rain, but yeah, that's what I do for a living. I'm a landscape gardener, and I had to shift about 5 ton of grey Welsh slate, which was fun. But
Nice.
there you go, gets the job finished, which is what it's all about, really, isn't it?
Well, it's better to shift slate in a when it's cool rather
Yeah,
than if it was this time last year, it'd be sort of 27 degrees. So
I'd have lost a lot of weight very quickly. Yes, this is it. Yeah, people don't always realise that working in hot weather is not as enjoyable as it looks like.
yeah,
Sometimes,
yeah,
sometimes it's nice.
yeah.
But thank you very much for joining us.
That's all right. Pleasure.
So, I mean, we can start off with what what got you started in horticulture, Chris? Am I right in thinking it was your grandmother? Maybe it was your first kind of person who led you in down the horticultural journey.
Yeah, it was. I mean, it was my grandmother who was on my father's side, who was largely self-taught gardener. Really, post-war generation, came from a very kind of ill-educated background, as a lot of kind of working class people did at that time, and so she left school at 13, and one of her jobs was to arrange the flowers in the local house. She went into service, and she arranged the flowers and amongst other things. And so she developed a sort of passion for just growing things that she could stick in a vase. And that's really where my interest was sparked. I mean, she's the person who very astutely bought me a windowsill propagator and a packet of seed for my 4th birthday. And, she knew exactly what she was doing, even though she wasn't horticulturally trained, she understood what it was to get somebody interested in horticulture and the steps that you needed. And so she bought me this packet of seed and a propagator and a little watering can, and I sort of gaily scattered the seed on a bit of damp tissue paper like everyone else, and on the windowsill, and watched them grow. And I was just fascinated. I just thought it was the most amazing thing. These sort of strange little inert objects springing into life, and then spinning the tray around as they grew, and watching them chase the light and all that sort of thing, and then harvesting them at the end as well, which was even the kind of the best thing. And what was, I think, her sort of stroke of genius, really. And I think I would put this to anybody who's trying to encourage someone else into gardening, is her stroke of genius was that she bought a packet of seeds, and every one of those seeds germinated. And so as a 4-year-old, you can imagine that delight and the confidence building as a consequence of every seed on that damp tissue paper germinated. And I just thought, what, I'm really good at this. And so I just thought, well, it must be a message here. This is what I've got to do in life. And it was only much later, of course, that I realized that the seed was actually cress. And daylight today, you buy some cress in the local garden centre. By the time you get it home, it's germinated in your pocket. But that was the thing, is it makes something that's, in those early stages, make something that's achievable, and have a target that is very attainable, and then you get hooked, don't you? And so I went from cress to trees. I missed out everything in between, because as a young boy, I didn't think there was anything of interest in between. So I went from sowing cress seed to collecting tree seeds, and sowing them in my parents' garden, and that was it, really.
Did they enjoy you seeding trees in their garden? Because I've say some trees, as you say, like a lot of them seeds, they can start off very small, and what they can become. Well, an oak tree would be a classic. Is a tiny little acorn, and give it 20 years, it can still become quite an impressive tree, even in that short amount of time.
Yeah, well, you're exactly right. I mean, my parents thought it was amusing to start with, because they gave me the patch of land that they couldn't grow anything on behind the garage. And they go, oh, right, this will contain everything. And but very quickly, my tree collection, which was all natives, it was things that I was just collecting from the hedgerows. And when we went on walks, I was stuffing my pockets full of seeds and bringing back things like field maples and ash and lime, certainly acorns as well for the quercus. And very quickly the space became a little bit too large, and we moved house. And my mother insisted that all the trees that I was growing came with us. So we had one van that was just for the trees. And in fact, there are some of those original trees that I sowed when I was 4 are still present in their new garden. So, however many years on, several decades on, they've still got some of those very early sowings from my sort of embryonic ventures into horticulture, which is quite interesting.
It must be lovely because obviously you've got children yourself, haven't you? So it must be nice that they can kind of see that when you were smaller than they were. I don't know how old your children are, but that they can kind of see, oh, that's what I was doing. I mean, it's just a nice, I suppose it's a lovely thing that kind of maybe what gardening and growing things is about is, as you say, I often say to customers, you're really only a custodian of a garden. You own it for however long you live there. But all the greats have always said, you're a custodian. You're looking after it. As you say, that tree you plant now, in 50, 80, 100, 200 years' time, it could still well be there. And as you say, you've added something to the future. That's what you do as a gardener in many ways. You do it to interest yourself at that point, but you're giving for the future.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think that, trying to get that across to people, the importance of not just enjoying the landscape that you create now, but thinking ahead and thinking what consequences is this going to have, and who, in the case of trees, because they're obviously slower growing and the time scale is far outreaches ours in most cases. Just to sort of sow that seed of curiosity in a child. Who do you think is going to sit under this tree? Who's going to benefit from the shade of this tree, or maybe make a den in it as we did when we were kids, or maybe collect the seeds from it and think of all the sort of biodiversity that's in the tree and the net effect that this will have. How long will it be here on this kind of spot? And then add to that the sort of stories about how, not just how trees have been used historically and the folklore attached to them, but also I think that some of the modern science which really switches kids on, which is that, as soon as you start to say to children, and I did it with mine, we've got there's a country park not very far away from where we are, in fact, just behind where I am in the office here. And it's a traditional kind of landscape park with an avenue of trees stretching off towards grand gates and then a big old pile at the end of it. And we were walking down there and I said to them, how long do you think these will remain straight in a straight line? And I was explaining to them that, trees, like everything, will move. And even though you plant a tree and you think, that tree's going to be there and now it's rooted to that spot, if you explain to them about the principles of contractile roots and the idea that, as you may know, they stretch their roots out in this kind of radial platform, seeking out nutrients and moisture. And if they find tasty morsels somewhere and they feel it's better than where they are, the roots will contract and the bole of the tree drags itself towards that favorable environment that the roots have found. And over centuries, you can look at some of the old avenues and see the sort of kinks in the avenue where the tree has moved in one direction or other to get either out of boggy ground or into a bit more moisture and a bit more fertility or whatever it is. So the fact that none of these things are static, and it may not be in our lifetime, but these trees are not, they're not just permanent fixtures in the landscapes. They are these wonderful organisms which interact with so many different other organisms and create a cycle around themselves. I just think it's fantastic, and love it when people, you sow that seed of enthusiasm, and I'm sure you have with customers too. You sow that seed of enthusiasm and you can start to see light bulbs going on and they try something and then they come back to you and they're like evangelical about horticulture because they've discovered something for themselves. And I think that's what's great about it. Gardeners are very generous and I think, sharing plant material, but also sharing knowledge and sharing enthusiasm. And that's, I think, what makes one gardener talking to another or talking to people about horticulture and gardening so exciting is that everyone's got something to learn and everyone sees things slightly differently.
Well, you're always learning. You'll never... And also, I think the wonderful thing about gardening is there are books that will tell you that plants should grow better here, as you say, it grows better in this. But there is actually the often thing is you'll often see a plant that you look and think, but that really shouldn't be surviving very well there, but they do. And it's the beautiful thing of try. There is no hard and fast rules necessary. You will be surprised that nature adapts. Yeah, like humans, you adapt, as they say. So, would you like to see more horticulture taught in schools? Not necessarily just to very young children, even to, because I know going back, probably maybe before our time, that horticulture and things like that would have been taught. kind of growing and things like that. Whereas it seems to have been, it's obviously a boom at the moment because obviously with the current situation with lockdown and everything, gardens have suddenly become, people have realised how important a garden actually really is. But would it be, do you think there's a way that we can get it more back in to get, because like all professions, you need the youngsters coming through.
Yeah,
no
you're
one
right.
Forever. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So it's how you get them into it. Now, is it worth doing something through national curriculum that kind of they do get taught these little tricks like you did with your grandmother, as you say? It ignites the fire, as they say.
Yeah, well, I think one of the interesting things is that when I was starting to get involved, I mean, I as I say, I started when I was 4. I knew what I wanted to do really all the way through primary school. I knew I wanted to grow plants, not necessarily what that meant professionally, but I knew I wanted to grow plants and be around people who were growing plants. And so when I went to secondary school, I knew that I wanted to study, biology, geology, and geography. So I wanted to do those more kind of earthy sciences. And in fact, when I was doing my options at school, one of the things that my school offered was something called rural studies. And rural studies took place in a big old Victorian lab with great big benches and raised stools and gas taps. And around the room were shelves and shelves of bell jars with specimens in. Everything from kind of shark's jaws down to, bits of mycorrhiza or whatever is, preserved and exhibited. And I wanted to do this because one of their activities was to go out, and they had, to all intents and purposes, a kitchen garden, an allotment that was a part of the classroom. And I wanted to do this as a study, and wanted to have it and do it as O-level. And my careers teacher just said, absolutely not. No, I mean, this is, without being, I think without distorting any of the truth here, his words to me were, rural study is for the remedial stream. And,
nice.
And it was considered something, gardening and growing plants and having an understanding of that side of science, the sort of practical application of science, was considered something that you did if you couldn't do anything else. And I think that, in many ways, that still persists to some extent. I mean, it was David Cameron, even when he was Prime Minister, made some rather banal comment about, the guys who perhaps weren't good enough for apprenticeships should go out and do gardening. And it's almost as though that it's a poor man's science or a poor man's activity. So absolutely, I agree. To be able to educate people, to understand that the complexities and the nuances, the various ways in which horticulture affects our lives, the current peat debate, for instance, biodiversity, the declining populations of bees, declining populations of worms, supporting an ever-growing worldwide population. That's all horticulture. That is all gardening, but on a grand scale. And so there's nothing, I think there's nothing you can't teach which can't be demonstrated in some way, either in a garden or using material from a garden. And whether you're teaching, hydraulics and looking at cellular pressure and the way that nutrients are absorbed through the roots and then pumped up to the leaves, or whether you're looking at tropisms and the fact that, how does a plant know if it's up or down, and how the way gravity works in a cell with a grain of starch, and the grain of starch touches the inside of the cell, and then the plant knows because of receptors that that's down. All of these sorts of things, that's kind of sophisticated science, which has a fundamental effect on how plants grow, which consequently has a fundamental effect on us and our success as a society and as the human race. So yeah, I think that it's a real shame that horticulture isn't viewed as a science, which it very clearly is. And I think partially because we, in my days lecturing as a horticultural lecturer and landscape architect, it's partially because we are a very disparate profession. A lot of us work in either individually or in small groups. It's a very focused profession. We very rarely get the opportunity to pool resources and come together. We don't necessarily have a very strong collective voice across a very broad spectrum of works and operations. Everything from kind of, technical hard landscaping and construction of swimming ponds down to, breeding new black currants or whatever it is. What is it that pulls all of us together? It's horticulture, but where's the voice? Where's that kind of platform from which we can reach out to people and say, do you know what? Whatever it is you're looking at, it in some way ties back to horticulture, growing plants, soils, the environment, and so on. And I think it's a great shame that as an industry, we don't stand up and say we can solve all of the problems the world faces right now. We can solve all those problems as horticulturalists and agroscientists and environmentalists and all those sorts of things. Pull everyone together, because that's where the solutions lie.
Yeah, and I think it's also, everything is connected. Even there's often schemes where they're trying to get corridors throughout. Just in Britain, corridors, and as you say, that little wildflower patch in your back garden, it might only be a metre square, but it's getting the realisation that actually that all the little things together, all combined, can all make something happen. It's a bit like the single voice. Yeah, well, the single voice gets another voice, and the pyramid effect. And as you're saying, I think it's just realising that even anyone just doing a small thing can have a huge impact. And quite simply, we're all connected by it, because even if you look at food is generally grown. Well, we all need it. If there is, there's the famous saying about bees. If bees, for whatever reason, died off, we would be pretty quick behind them, they say, because of what they pollinate, and insects and just all insects. All insects are important, even if you don't like slugs. I'm sure you don't if they've eaten your lettuce or anything, but they're all part of the food chain, and people have to realise that everything is connected, and you need to keep that harmony. And as you say, but yeah, I do get what you mean about it's almost kind of a bit like a poor man's job, or gardener, or anyone can do that. Well. Yeah. There's more to it than that, but there's more to life than that. I do know what you mean. Yeah, I've had it before. Are you a gardener? Yeah. So yes, as you say, yeah. Who do you think grows your food then? They're all gardeners of a different type, shall we say?
I have a very similar experience where I sat down at I was invited to one of these kind of posh functions where you sit down in black tie and all that sort of thing. Some years. And it was very interesting. A table of people I didn't know, so sort of 8 or 12 people I didn't know. So everyone, goes around politely introducing themselves and that sort of thing. And the guy that was sitting next to me was a sort of a very well-heeled elderly gent who looked at me and he just sort of said, and you are, and I told him who I was, and he said, and you do. And and it's that point where I have a slight kind of mischievous streak where I will either try and explain what it is I do, or I'll just say I'm a gardener. Because I think if you say you're a gardener, it's a real test of that individual's personality. And I said to him, I'm a gardener. And he just sort of looked at me and said, oh. And then he spent the entire rest of the evening talking to the person to the other side, and he didn't even think it was appropriate or relevant to engage in a conversation. And yet the person I was sitting on the other side of said, a gardener, wow, do you know, I don't know anything about gardening. I'd love to get involved. And suddenly a conversation unfolded. And I think sometimes you're right. There is this sense that being a gardener, it's seen as more of an extended hobby rather than a profession. And I think it's the difference between, or maybe I should say, it's similar to somebody who is a professional chef being called a cook. We all cook things, but that doesn't make us a chef. We all have gardens and garden, but that doesn't make us a professional gardener. And I think that degree of explanation and sort of protraction of professional skills and knowledge hasn't necessarily been fully demonstrated. But just to go back to that point about everything being connected, we did a program some years ago about soil, and we were talking with various people about soils and people in the profession. And what startled everybody is that civilization clings to about 30 centimeters of living matter in some parts of the earth.
And that's what we all cling to. That's what we're all dependent on. So when you see landscape contractors and developers driving over soil and trashing it and compacting it and flooding it and not looking after it, or farmers thrashing it to within an inch of their life with artificial fertilizers and tilling it at the wrong time, et cetera, it's just a complete disrespect for what is the most complex ecosystem. And it's that ecosystem, that 30 centimeters really of topsoil in most places, which is keeping us all going. If that is allowed to disappear, then clearly nothing happens. And that's we don't have to look very far back to see the effects of that. Even in the UK, we're used to seeing pictures of a dust bowl in the US, in the 1920s. But if you looked into places like Thetford Forest, for instance, Thetford Forest is there because the land was mismanaged, there was no organic matter being planted on, and the soil blew away. And so now the only thing that will grow is rather kind of brashy conifers. So it's frightening how vulnerable that soil is. And we don't make the link between the vulnerability of the soil and our own vulnerability. There's a sort of arrogance about us, really, which I think we just need to be a little bit more humble about who we are and how we integrate with other organisms.
Yeah, well, yeah, I totally agree, because as you say, there's more life in that little square patch of soil. I think they've said that there's more life in a metre square of soil, organisms that you can't necessarily see or touch or feel like that, than there is humans on the planet.
Yep.
And that sometimes brings it into thinking, well, we're obviously a massively expanding race. And as you say, some say, are we the best thing or the worst thing on the planet? Well, we can do wonderful things, but we can also we're the very best and the very worst, I would say, of the living organisms on the planet. We can do wonderful things, but this is, as you say, it's that happy balance, and sometimes we get it wrong. And I do agree with you about, yes, you see a lot of modern developments, they try and kind of keep their green credentials up, but then you kind of look and think, but you've given with one hand, and often you've taken far more by, as you say, the way they do it, or they just throw stuff in. And I'm working on houses on a new development at the moment, and they are trying to make it more. And I did make a comment of the pretty awful piece of land they left with rocks and boulders. Oh no, it's wildflowers, they'll be all right. And I just kind of looked and just thought, yeah, you can't just chuck some wildflower down and go, oh yeah, but we put some wildflower down. Oh, that's okay then. But as you say, the land's been driven on, and it's almost made the flooding problem is built on a bit boggy land anyway. The flooding problem can only get worse because you've put houses on it, and they've built balancing ponds. Unfortunately, the balancing ponds, when it rained the other day, I didn't notice them filling up with water, but I did notice plenty of other places where they're not balancing ponds. And I think it's just that little bit of thinking about it. But then it's always the last thing on, well, unfortunately, it comes to money, these things. And I think it's the last thing on their mind, or the bit they can always pinch from. Oh, we need some flashy kitchens to sell these houses. We'll nick it from the landscaping budget. It's always been the way, and it's sad, and it shouldn't happen, and it's allowed to happen. But yeah, one of those things, it would take a long time to get over it. Now, Chris, so we're doing this kitchen garden magazine. Do you have a little allotment at home or a patch for growing your veg?
So I do, yes.
Excellent.
So we've got a barn in the Cotswolds, which has got a piece of old agricultural land around it, which we've turned into an ornamental garden. And originally we had various terraces as herb gardens and kitchen gardens and that sort of thing, but it was too difficult to manage in what is quite a concentrated area. So we approached in the village we're in. There are some village allotments, and we took one of those on. And so we've got what was actually an abandoned allotment. Like a lot of people, you pick it up, and it's definitely seen some perennial weed. So the first job inevitably was just to clear it, and so I went in and trimmed it all down, took all the brashings away, and then flame-throwed it, and just went over very briefly with a flamethrower just to kill the annual weeds, and then dug it over, taking out as much of the perennial as possible, sheeted it over with geotextile, and then just let it rest and let the soil kind of find its level. And then we put on loads of organic matter, loads of local farmyard manure. It's the one thing that we're not short of around here in the Cotswolds.
That's always useful.
It's some good old farmyard manure that's well rotting. Put some of that on, and then started to improve the ground gradually. So and it's not great this season, really. It's not an ideal season to be dabbling in fruits and veg, just because
well, as you will know, cold and dry to start with. So nothing was really growing because it was everything in the Cotswolds here. I mean, we had 3-4 weeks where the temperature at night didn't raise above freezing. And daytime temperatures were still sort of hovering around 5-6, although it was clear and dry. And then almost at the flick of a switch, we went from that to slightly milder, only ever so slightly milder, but wet. And everything then grows through. So yeah, we were out on the allotment yesterday and just putting a few plants in and putting cloches on. I hope they're still there. Just sort of tending that. So yeah, we've got our onions and our garlics, and we've got our peas and beans, and a few things still to go out. We've great fans of courgettes and butternut squash and that sort of thing. Growing a few herbs. We've green manure as well around the place where we can't cultivate right now, or if we're yet to plant green manures in. And a collection of fruit trees that grow at the sort of higher altitudes. We're fairly high here in the Cotswolds, so the bit that we're in, so go for the more cold tolerant ones. But I mean, it's great. I mean, it's what's lovely is what I like about it is that it's a complete separation from the ornamental garden at home. So when you step outside at home, you feel really pressured to keep it neat and tidy, and there's always a job to do. Whereas I think gardening, and it's only just a couple of 100 meters away from home, but gardening on the allotment gives you a completely different emotional response, I suppose, an emotional effect. You know, it's a much more free, much more peaceful. You sort of take your time. You can come back and do jobs because you don't have to keep it looking tidy all the time.
It's yours as well. That's why I love my allotment. I mean, I've just moved house, so my allotment's actually at home now. But I've always loved an allotment, and people will say, but you do that for a living. You can call yourself a horticulturalist. There you go. That's the posh gardener and a horticulturalist. But I said, yes, but it's mine, and it's totally different from doing it for someone else or designing it, because it's my little thing, and I can relax there. And you can, I imagine you've done the same. You can spend a couple of hours on an allotment, and sometimes you spend most of the time chatting to other people on other allotments. But just the time goes, and it's just a wonderful, relaxing way of being.
Yeah, I think you're right, and there's something about the friendliness, the warmth, I think, on an allotment that you don't necessarily get in a gardening community with people, even when houses are adjacent. You know, sometimes you get a cohesive community like that, but more often than not, if you go onto the allotment, there's always somebody there who, especially if you're new to the allotments, there's always somebody there who's willing to give you a bit of advice about what to grow, what the conditions are like. You know, what they've had successes with, the history of that, or share some of the surplus plant material. You know, it's a proper kind of old-fashioned community. And I first came across allotments when I was 5, 6, something like that. My grandfather had 3 allotments, in fact. My dad had 2 allotments, and you know, we used to wander down. I mean, they were in different places, but we'd wander down to whoever's allotment we were going to. And everyone had the obligatory shed, and the guys spent most of their weekend, I think, sitting in the shed brewing various dodgy wines and beers, to be honest. Anything
sounds like mine got,
anything that was a surplus on the allotment seemed to end up in the kind of brewing area of the shed. But yeah, I mean, just a great escape, really. And I think just to be able to grow a few things. I mean, you know, we're not trying to be self-sustaining, but to grow a few fruits and veg, and as you will know, the first strawberries you pick, or the peach that you pick, or whatever it is, it's the best one you're going to have. So I just think it's great. It keeps everybody grounded, and I think reminds you know what the weather is doing as well. You know, if you want to know what the weather's doing, ask a gardener, because they will always be able to tell you not what the weather's doing now, but what it was like last week, last month, last season, what they're looking forward to, what's been suppressed, what's been forced, etc. You know, it's a much more analytical approach to understanding the way that the weather and the climate is moving and shifting and drifting through. Yeah,
because I always think it makes you feel. I always realise when you look at nature and down your allotment, how actually quite insignificant. We like to think as a race we're wonderful and we control all these things. But where you actually realise suddenly how quite insignificant we are if nature flexes her muscles, shall we say, that we are. And as you said, that's what I love about it. It just goes to show that, as you say, just that part of it. So I've just got to turn some power on, I think. There we go. Should all be on. I think my phone was running out of power for a second. Yeah, that's the wonderful thing of it. Now, Chris, move on to the next thing. Of course, you're a gold medal winning a man at Chelsea. How do you think this change? Are you doing anything at the new Chelsea? Can we call it? Everything seems to have the new as it's fitted in front of it because it's obviously now in September, I think, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right.
Rather than May.
End of September. So we did the last garden we did was 2019. So 2020 obviously was cancelled altogether, and they just did the virtual Chelsea. And in 2019, or actually in the run up to 2019, we'd already made the decision that we didn't want to do anymore. Really, we'd done 5 in a row, and I think we've done 23 or 24 shows altogether. So we pretty much stepped back, and the sponsor that we had at the time, Morgan Stanley, had also decided that actually they only wanted to do 5. So it was quite a nice conclusion to being at Chelsea. And you always miss being there, both as an exhibitor or even if you don't visit. This September, I think the one in September will be quite interesting. It's fascinating listening to people's responses to the move to September. There's a lot of people who perhaps don't think that it's going to be quite the same and not quite have the same prestige. But I think from a planting point of view, it's of course the first time that we will have seen those late summer, early autumn species exhibited and used in gardens. And perhaps more interesting, what the nursery folk bring, and what is it that they're able to bring on stream, which is looking great in at that time of the year. I think it's not an easy thing to do because we have the advantage when we do it in spring that everything gets better. So if you bring a tree onto site and it's emerging foliage, know if you keep it well tended, it's going to flourish and get better. The hedges unfurl. Herbaceous plants will put on 2, 3, 4 inches and come into flower. And I think that the challenge for anyone exhibiting at Chelsea this year, garden or nursery, is that if you challenge a plant at that point in its life, it's going to retract rather than advance. And so it's going to become stressed. The petals will fall, the flowers will fade, the foliage will turn, etc., etc. And of course, you don't have the advantage of the root balled plants that we just catch the end of the root ball season for the big trees and hedges. And of course, you won't be able to do that in September. Everything will have to be container grown or have been containerized. So I do think that from a practical perspective, it's a challenge. But from a horticultural viewer's perspective, I think it's fascinating because, hopefully you'll see all of those things like the heleniums and the echinaceas are all starting to all those kind of late summer prairie plants that we're used to seeing at some of the other shows. You'll see those starting to come through, but also fruiting plants as well, so that there will be plants which have fruit on them rather than blossom. So I think that will be interesting as well. Maybe you'll get a completely different audience at Chelsea. Actually, they will be much more, I think, the kind of old school approach to gardening, because I don't know about you, but when I learned my horticulture, autumn was the time to plant. Autumn was the time when everyone went manic in the garden. It was digging, it was bare root. The whole preparation and planting was done autumn, well, really kind of end of September through to early March.
Well, feeding the soil. As you say, you'd be getting your mulches down to feed the soil so that you have a nice spring.
Yep.
Exactly. Because I was chatting to Medwin Williams, who does obviously another Chelsea gold winner, and because I said to him, because often when he shows his vegetables, he's showing them out of season in May, because quite a lot of them, that's not when they're going. And he says, so it'll be different, but it's nice because actually you're growing them in their normal growing spell. At the end of September, there's certain things like squashes and things like that, and a lot of bigger root carrots and things like that, leeks. That is their natural time to be picked and eaten and shown. So he says, but it just brings a different aspect to it. But no, I agree with you. I think it's going to be different, because it will be, because obviously it's a different time of the year. But as you say, that's an interesting bit. As you say, it's going to take a bit more management, because things are on the wane. They're not on the up. They're all starting to look to kind of, anything deciduous is going to start thinking, if we have a cold snap there, we might have a hot September, but we might have a cold one. So it's keeping that happy balance.
I think also it'll be the first time that you've seen autumn colour at Chelsea as well. Because if the nurseries, we know that we can shunt plants by about a month, depending on how we treat them. So if the nurseries have deliberately dried off acers, for instance, and dried the pots off, and then give them just enough water to keep them going, it will force them, especially as you say, if we've got blue skies and a bit of cool evenings, they will be able to force the autumn colour. So you potentially see fruiting and autumn colour and the kind of last gasp flowers, which brings a very, very different atmosphere to that environment.
Yeah. Have you spotted any trends so far this year in the veg growing world and in horticulture worlds that you think that might be shown at places like Chelsea or Hampton Court, for instance? That's still on the same time.
Yeah, I'm not sure about being shown. I think that certainly the trends that we've seen in terms of the clients that we deal with and the types of plants that they're growing, the types of questions that come in from clients, and also on Gardener's Question Time, that sort of thing, they're much more about the more traditional crops. I think there's a real resurgence of interest in things like the French beans, the Borlotti beans, broad beans. People are interested in some of the more unusual varieties, the older varieties, different coloured fruits as well. So going for yellow and white raspberries rather than the conventional red forms. So I think that's quite reassuring, because there was a couple of years ago, there was this sort of trend for sort of exotic fruit and veg that was, because it was different, the kind of electric daisy, for instance. I mean, everyone wanted to grow that because they thought that it was going to be a great edible. And actually, the reason that nobody had ever heard of it is because it's a horrible little thing that nobody wants to eat. So, what's the point in growing it? I think what's happened is we maybe have dabbled in those sorts of things and discovered that actually there's a world of heritage fruits and veg which really merit some attention. And those are the sorts of things that we're being asked questions about, heritage tomatoes. So everyone wants to grow the gardener's delight because it's fail safe. You can stick it on the side and, let it get on.
Yeah.
But what about some of the more unusual things? What about brandy wine or something like that? That is a little bit more tricky, but actually really, really fun to grow.
Yeah. Well, I'd only say to you one word on that, on growing things. That a thing was cucamelons. It took me ages to grow any, and then I finally grew and got them, and they look wonderful. Don't get me wrong, they look wonderful. Pretty bland and horrible, if I'm being honest. I thought they were going to be something amazing, and I ate one, and I thought, I've been doing that all these years, and I finally get them, and they're really not. Well, I wouldn't say they're horrible, but they're not they look better than they are taste-wise, shall we say.
Exactly. It looks good on a seed packet or in a photograph in a magazine, but doesn't look good when you present it on a plate. And I think those sorts of things are a great example that just because we can doesn't mean we need to. In the case of something like cucamelon,
Yeah, I'm picking on it. I shouldn't say that. We've had a bit interesting in the spring we've had. How do you think it's going to affect going forward the growing season for plants, not just for the shows, but how do you think it's going to affect it overall, do you think? Because we've had as you say, we have had a funny, I get the global warming is a thing, but I sometimes think the planet will warm up and cool down, and I don't think it necessarily really worries about what we do, because if it wanted to get rid of us, I think it would be a flick of the hand and we're gone. But I tend to find, certainly in England, I think it's the more extremes we're getting now. I don't necessarily, the seasons seem to blend into one a little bit more. Winters aren't quite as cold, etc. Summers are hotter. But as I say, this is part of the thing that obviously in the growing, in whether it be vegetables, plants, trees, I think it's something we've got to overcome. It's the extremes of, and maybe at the wrong times when you wouldn't expect to get a frost. But there again, we did do. I live quite near I'm on the Hampshire, Surrey, Berkshire borders. You only have to go back kind of 50, 60 years and you'd have had snowdrifts in Surrey and Kent, and they would have been 20-foot high snowdrifts. So it's not as though we haven't had these extremes, but are we affecting it that much that we're doing it, or is it just the planet naturally expanding? I suppose we have to look at it on a planetary level, not just looking at like dear old Blighty and what we're doing, is what's everyone else doing, and is that what's the problem is as such.
Yeah, that's right. I think the reassuring thing, the spring that we've had, we certainly, if here gardening here in the Cotswolds is anything to go by, the autumn was very mild and reasonably wet.
Then we had a period of really cold, dry weather. We had we had 4 snowfalls. We had 2 within 10 days. The second 2 not being very long and also not very deep. I mean, a couple of inches, and that was it. And then, as we said earlier, that kind of dry period which suppressed everything, and now gone into that kind of wetter weather, but without the temperatures lifting. And I think what we're seeing here, and we're at around about 900 feet, just over 900 feet, is that we're about a month behind this time last year. Now, admittedly, last year was an exceptional season in terms of when spring kicked in and the temperatures achieved, and the fact we didn't have any rain, clear blue skies, etc. So perhaps it's unfair to judge this year against last year, but it shows you that I reckon we're about 4 weeks adrift. And the good news is that the plants will catch up. They've seen many more variations in weather than we have. You think about the sort of broad spectrum of plants that we grow. They've spent millions of years evolving to cope with mercurial springs, and we've only seen a handful of them. So I think that they will catch up. Most of them are fairly resilient, especially those that are being grown in reasonable conditions where the plant choice was also reasonable for those conditions. What we'll see inevitably is a sort of concertinaing of flowering and fruiting. So the plants which would traditionally have come and gone by now still haven't flowered in the garden at home. So I mean, our things like Fritillaria persica, for instance, is still in flower, and we normally see that as a March-April plant. Here we are, reaching the end of May, and it's still in its prime. The geranium phaeums have only just started to flower, and normally they're done and dusted by the beginning of May. So what we'll see is all of those plants sort of drifting on into early summer, as well as if the weather does pick up and we do have, what they're promising as a slightly warmer spell and less rain and wind and so on. So your traditional summer plants will then come on stream as well. So you'll get this sort of strange amalgam of late spring and early summer plants all sort of colliding. And it reminds me of, I years ago was working with a woman up in Shetland, and we were talking about gardening in Shetland. I was up in her garden in Shetland, and she was saying, we get spring, summer, and autumn all together in 2 months, and that's what happens if you challenge the plants. Everything is pressed together, and everything happens all in the same time. And I was standing in her garden in the middle of the summer, and there were daffodils in flower. And it's just that everything kind of is as I say, concertinaed. So I kind of take heart in the fact that the plants are much more resilient than most plants are much more resilient than we give them credit for. Sometimes it spoils our designs, and sometimes it spoils our plans for rotation and harvest and all that sort of thing. But in the greater scheme of things, it's one spring that's a bit of a challenge. And some crops will do much better this year than they did last year with a bit of extra moisture and those slightly cooler temperatures. So I think we just have to learn to adapt to a changeable environment rather than trying to constantly do the same thing year on year and expect the environment to stay the same. The environment has never stayed the same, and it will never stay the same. Yeah. So I think we've got to use our skill set to learn what the parameters are and have reserves. And in a way, that's a great lesson from something like Chelsea. When we're doing gardens at Chelsea, we grow a range of crops for in case it's an early season, and we grow a range of crops in case it's a late season. And we sometimes divide those crops into 2 locations of growing, one in the north, one in the south, so that we get the kind of different nuances of the speed at which spring comes through. And for each plant we choose, that we think we want to exhibit, we will also then have at least one substitute in the early and late category. So for any one plant that arrives, there might have been 3 or 4 others that were grown as a precaution. And I think maybe that's the way in terms of growing our fruits and veg. Maybe that's the way we need to start thinking is to not just religiously sow our leeks or whatever it is at the end of February because that's what the packet says, but teach people to understand what's going on with the season and what the consequences of that would be. And that, of course, is the old-fashioned way of gardening. That's the sort of thing that our grandparents would have been very tuned into, and old agriculturalists and horticulturalists. That old story of
I'm sure you've heard it of, well, the version I heard was about East Anglian farmers dropping their trousers and sitting on the tilled ground to see if it was time to put their onion sets in. And if they stood up and they got piles, it was too early to put the onion sets in. And it's that type of thing. You're sort of reading the environment and the condition you're in, rather than just doing it by rote, as it were. And I think that's where, to go back to your comment about Readly, that's what I find quite interesting about the Readly platform. I don't know if you've looked at it, but in the sort of gardening sphere, there are about 25 magazines that are on offer in the English-speaking section, about 25 magazines that go back as far as 2014. So you're seeing and able to get access to articles from gardeners, including people like Medwin, for instance, as far back as 2014, writing about the various springs. So not only is it encyclopedic, because there's something written about just about every subject, but also it's very indicative, especially the weeklies, very indicative of the way that the spring was kicking in and how people were reacting to that. And I think the more of that we can ingrain in people, that, read the situation rather than do it as according to the RHS encyclopedia, I think that's a much better way of gardening, to be honest. It's sort of, you're just in tune with what's out there, rather than being in a situation where you're doing it because somebody's told you to do it, but you don't have any allied knowledge. And I think that's the beauty of that body of knowledge that's on that really digital platform. And I think on a day like today, I mean, we've got a rain forecast for tomorrow as well. And it just isn't worth going outside. I think, you can spend the day just genning up on your horticultural skills via other people's authored pieces and inspirational photographs and so on. And then your time isn't wasted.
Yeah, no, well, yeah, even sound funny if saying about the RHS, and even they, in the recent years, changed their things. As you say, they realise they've got to be a little bit more adaptive, quite simply. You can't just stick by these hard and fast rules that have been there for 100 years. And because I know they changed there, as you say, how plants are grown, what kind of their bands and this is good to grow in this. They've made it slightly more complex, haven't they? Not massively complex, but kind of said there are subsections to the thing. You can't just say, well, there you go, there's 10 areas, and it'll grow in a 10. This is good for 1, 2, or 3. Now they've realised that you have to be adaptive. But I think you're right. It's the local knowledge, a bit like you say down the local allotment. The old boys, they've got the local knowledge often with what does go, even with pests and diseases.
Yep.
You'll have trouble with them, some club roots in the ground there, and as you say, but you wouldn't necessarily know club roots in the ground unless someone told you, or obviously you investigated it. And I think that's you can't deny that wonderful thing of learning from other people in your area, and you'll find out what grows well, why it grows well. Maybe there is no rhyme nor reason, it just does. And as you say, but these are the things you can only learn. And I must say about...
Also just moving things from one side of the garden to another. So you'll know that you can have a very sheltered, warm, free draining area of the garden, and 2 paces away, 3 paces away, the other side of the garden, completely different. And some soils are much more suitable for growing plants which are from different extremes. So for instance, I've got one area of my garden where I've got sweet peas growing next to hostas, growing next to a wisteria, and some cyclamen and a hemerocallis, and an edgeworthia. And you sort of think, well, actually, none of those things really should go together. But they do because of the nature of the soil. We're gardening here on a really quite heavy clay, but then underneath about 30 centimetres of clay is very free draining Cotswold brash. So there's enough moisture retained in the clay with the additional organic matter that we put on to keep things like the hostas going. But the clay is free draining enough because of the organic matter we put on for the sweet peas to thrive too. So I think it's understanding those enormous nuances really, and the diversity and complexity of the site. Reading your site, and one of the first things I was taught as a student was do nothing in the garden. And in fact, my tutor said, do nothing for a year. When you move into do nothing, just watch what happens, watch where the sun comes up, watch where the wind goes through, where various plants come up, read the plants which are coming up, and then you'll be informed, and then you can make the best steps. So I think patience sometimes is actually something that we lack in gardening.
I think that's good advice. I've been told that many times before as well, is that enjoy your garden, don't rush into it, see what grows well where. Because the garden will tell you what grows well where. You can't force it, it will do what it wants. As you say, certain things don't like a bit of shade, and there's little wind tunnels you get in gardens as well, just naturally forming, and you'll find that, but that's the perfect place for it. Well, it just might have been a wind tunnel, whether it be there's a shed near it or something like that. And things like, like aces, like little Japanese aces, don't like wind tunnels. They don't like full sun, and it's very small things. Not saying they won't, but a little thing like that can stop you having a really nice plant to just kind of, well, it didn't really do anything, which is what I often get told by customers. Well, I put it there and it's never really done anything. And you're kind of like, yeah, there will be a reason why it's done nothing.
Yeah.
Excellent. Right, now, Chris, you're well known for your garden designs, and you do like to harmonise nature and wildlife. Have you got any simple tips for the readers of Kitchen Garden to kind of not a hard and fast rule, but little things you can do that you think will help people in designing their gardens, that you think are good tips to start with that can set you on the right course?
Yeah, I think in terms of productive gardens, I'd certainly advocate making the compost heap as big as possible, and also maybe choosing where the compost heap goes before you do anything else. Because if you get a good composting system and you've got your compost in the right place, you'll get a very good compost very quickly. And most people put the compost heap where they can't grow anything, or in an unfavourable, unsightly area. But think of the compost heap as the engine room, and therefore give it due credit and put it in a favourable position. So, it should be, of course, sheltered from cold winds, sheltered from direct sunshine, in a kind of ameliorated area where the temperature and moisture levels remain pretty much static. So underneath trees actually is pretty good. I've got mine underneath a big sycamore tree on the allotment here, and it does really well. It rots down really quickly. So make the compost heap large enough, but position it. And I always say, if it's the sort of spot you might want to sit in on a summer's day, then that's probably the spot you need to put your compost heap in, because you need that kind of cool, ameliorated environment that's just kind of calmed down. It's neither one extreme nor the other. And then you'll get really hot compost, and you can get your compost turning around, especially if you're putting enough greenery on. You can put it on, and it'll be 6-7 months, and you can empty it and then put it onto the garden and start again. And of course, you have multiple bays. So I think that's really important. And I think don't underestimate the power of birds. We've got bird feeders and bird tables on the allotment and all around the garden at home. We never do any spraying for pests. We just let the birds take them off. Certainly on things like my pear, I've got a fan-trained pear, and the pear is very prone to aphids. But we just hang little fat balls on the branches of the pear. And the blue tits come along, even in summer. They come along, and they'll be queuing up very politely to peck at the fat balls. And whilst they're waiting for their turn on the fat balls, they peck off the aphids too. Yeah, so I would certainly advocate that. And I think don't be too malicious in terms of wasps. In fact, I was having a conversation just the other day with a journalist and trying to explain. She was saying, she hated wasps, and I said, no, don't hate wasps. Wasps are actually really good news in the garden. Yeah. They harvest more caterpillars and cabbage white caterpillars than any other organism coming in. So if you can get wasps into the garden, or if you can tolerate wasps into the allotment area, then in the early part of the season, they take more caterpillars than anything else, any other single source. So it's that type of thing that I think is really useful. And also, of course, just looking after the ground conditions. We touched on soil a few moments ago, and making sure that you put lots of organic matter on, lots of really well rotted organic matter, and lay it on the soil, and let the macroorganisms and the microorganisms do all the hard work. So after the initial dig of the allotment, we're not going to do anything to our allotment. It is just mulch on the top, and then leave it for the winter, and let the earthworms do the hard work. And it's amazing how quickly well rotted manure gets incorporated into the ground. And of course, if you've got a healthy population of ground beetles, they're controlling some of the more pernicious pests, especially the root nibbling pests.
And if you've got a healthy population of worms, then that's controlling your drainage and aeration, reducing compaction and so on. And of course, as you will well know, when a worm starts to digest organic matter, it goes through the gut of the worm several times. In fact, it's reputed to go through 7 times. And every time it goes through the gut, there's a kind of mucus which is extruded from the back end of the worm, and that adds to the water holding capacity of the soil. So it's increasing drainage in conditions like today when it's pouring with rain, but it's also increasing water holding capacity as well due to this kind of mucus, which is the result of worm casts. And so those sorts of things, gardening in tune with the organisms which are sharing your plot, I think is really, really important.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. Yeah, I totally agree. I did enjoy your picture on a social media platform. You had a very nice is a kind of flower crown for UK Gardening Day. Very nice. Was this all your own handiwork?
No, it wasn't, sadly. No, it was a local florist. No, my handiwork would have been slightly more primitive than that. But I think it's a great initiative, really. Yeah. Garden Day, getting people outside, and the impetus of that really is to get people outside and not to worry about toiling in the garden, but just sit and enjoy.
Enjoy it, yes.
And I think sometimes we beat ourselves up as gardeners and as professional gardeners. We beat ourselves up that we're not, we sit down for 5 minutes and then feel guilty about it. And actually, I think one of the great attributes of the garden and one of the great signs of it being a very confident garden is that you've got plenty of places to sit down. And I think if you don't mind sitting down and just absorbing, then you kind of gather your thoughts. You can then prioritize your jobs, enjoy the fruits of your labors, and then go forwards when you feel like it. I think we spend a bit too much time worrying about what we should be doing rather than enjoying what we've actually done.
Which often from my customers, I imagine yours as well, is they may not particularly be gardeners themselves, but they want to enjoy a garden, which is hence why they employ a gardener to do it, to make it look nice so they can enjoy it. So as you're saying, it's something that we should maybe take from our own customers and take on board for ourselves as such. Now, you're a long-standing man on doing Gardener's Question Time, and I think, and I've said to a couple of other people, Bob Flowerdew, Toby Buckland, I think you're quite brave to go on something like that, because it's not particularly, I know slightly scripted is the wrong word, but you have a little bit of prior knowledge. But you're a brave man to go on a programme like that with people phoning up and testing your knowledge. It would terrify me, and I imagine it would terrify 99.9% of any professional gardener being suddenly put there, and actually you're on show and someone's just hitting you with a question. I mean, I like it when some people just say, I don't know, it's not my area of expertise. It's nice to see that, whereas some people, unfortunately, sometimes try and blather their way out of it and it doesn't work out very well. But I think I take my hat off to you and other professionals like that are willing to go on it. But it does look like it's a wonderful thing to go on, Gardener's Question Time. Or a hero, could I say? Yeah,
it's a great institution, really. And first time I went on anything like that many years ago, at the other end of the panel was Bob Flowerdew. Funnily enough, you mentioned his name.
Yeah, Bob. Yeah, him. Yeah.
Down at the Bath and Wells showground, I think it was, and Bob was quite rightly very suspicious about who this young, precocious character was who was sitting at the opposite end of the panel. But I think one of the great things is that you very quickly learn what your fellow panelists feel comfortable answering, and also the chair. When Eric was doing it, and certainly when Peter and Kathy now do it, they also know what our particular areas of expertise and strength are and what we feel comfortable doing. But also they know if they can, tease us about various things, successes and or failures. And so actually you never feel completely isolated. It isn't, you don't feel as though you're in the kind of professional spotlight. There's always somebody there to help, and very often, because what goes out on air is only a fraction of what's actually recorded. We might record. In fact, I did one on Wednesday that's about to go out. We recorded just a few days in advance, and I did one on Wednesday, and the I think the record was 2.5 hours, and it goes out for 40 minutes or so. So, you know, there's a lot of surplus material, but very often what happens is you get, if somebody's going off on the wrong track, one of us will step in and kind of gently, you know, corral them back in the right direction. And, you know, we all make that mistake because you mishear something, or you're busy writing the question down, and you miss a key point. So, you know, it's, and I think you're right. It's also about not, you know, none of us know everything, and we might know something from our own experience and perspective. So you sort of give advice on that basis, really. And I think in my early days, I used to say things like, I don't know, Lavatera won't grow in these conditions, or whatever it is. And that's an absolute guarantee that somebody's going to put their hand up and say, I've got exactly those conditions and mine does very well, thank you. So you tend to phrase things in a much more generalistic way, which is, in my experience, I've not had success with Lavatera in those conditions. Just so that you're not really putting your sort of head on the block. But it's great fun, and you know, it's a lovely team to work with, and we've had some great fun. Prior to lockdown, of course, we used to travel all around the country. So we used to spend a lot more time together, and sometimes sort of in various dodgy hotels in the sort of outback and outreaches of the UK. And more recently, of course, we've been doing it on Zoom, and that's a completely different experience. Because when you're sitting in a panel in a straight line, you can't see the other person's face. You know, you can crane around a little bit, but you can't really see it because you're talking to a live audience. But on Zoom, of course, you're looking at their face, so you can see when people are getting a bit nervous or a bit, or you know,
what's he talking about?
Lost. Yeah, exactly. So I think it's a very different experience. But I have to say that doing it in front of a live audience is just fantastic, because you can really play the audience, and you know, gardeners they come along with exactly the right spirit. And it's great fun to be able to, you know, sometimes tease and tempt and be a bit mischievous around them. Very often you get questions along the lines of, a friend of mine has done this to this plant, and they said it's died. What advice would you give them? We drill into it, and we very often find that actually it's the person that's asked the question, or it's their partner who's sitting next to them in the audience, you know, who's done it. So we learn quite a lot about the people that we're being questioned by. But yeah, it's great fun, and I'm surprised, you know, how many people listen to that program, not just in the UK but worldwide as well on the platform. And how relevant it is for people who don't have a garden, and the number of people who contact the show and say, I don't have a garden, I don't have a balcony, I don't grow plants. But what I enjoy listening to is a community of people who are enthusiastic, talking with, you know, delight about their subject. And that is it's just a very settling program, really, in that respect. You know, it's just a very easy listen, and occasionally you might learn something, which is great.
I think it is. I saw another chap. He's on Terry Walton. He's often on radio too.
Yeah, I know
and
Terry.
The amount of he's a lovely chap, Terry. And but as he said to me before, and I spoke to him, a lot of people, they actually ring up and they don't grow vegetables, but they just like listening to Terry and his tales from the plot. And it's just a wonderful thing. And they're not really they'd like to, then he encourages people to do things, but it's just that kind of, they just love that kind of natural thing that I think gardeners have, are just down to earth, just telling you as you said, as I find it. That's all you can do, is say, as I find it. I do agree with you about that. My friend is always, you mean you. Yeah, that old one, but it's all fun. But yeah, no, I watched one of the Zoom recordings a good couple of months ago, and it is a bit different. But as you say, I imagine, like all performers, you want that live audience because you feed off them. If you've got a good audience, it can make a good show. I'm not saying a bad audience makes a bad show, but a good audience can make elevate more than it is as such.
Yeah, so, well, we've certainly learned over the years that the audiences who are most vociferous and most energetic are the audiences, firstly, where it's a particular gardening club. So, you know, they all know one another, so their guard is lowered. And also, if somebody at the gardening club has decided to serve wine before the recording, once the gardener has a glass or two of wine, then you can guarantee that it's going to get a bit risque and a bit raucous, which is great fun.
You have to struggle to get out sometimes, I'm sure.
There's always a back door.
Well, this is it. The other one I ask, because I do watch Beechgrove. I don't always watch it, but I remember when I first watched it, I remember thinking, Beechgrove, which is set up quite a way in Scotland, isn't it? Is it Aberdeenshire way?
It's Aberdeen.
And then you appeared, and I thought, Chris Beardshaw lives nowhere near Scotland. How did you become part of that? Which is what you are an integral part of Beechgrove. I know you don't live there, but you're an integral part of the show.
So I had worked with the production company on a different program. We did a program in Northern Ireland, and for BBC Northern Ireland, for that production company, and so Turn Television are also responsible, certainly for the last 15, 20 years or something, of doing Beechgrove. Turn they're part now of a larger organisation, but they were based in Aberdeen, and I went to a Garden Writers Guild meal, the kind of end of the year.
Yes, I've just joined the Garden Media Guild now, isn't it? They've changed their name.
Right.
Yeah, no, funny enough, I've just joined them. So
yeah, and I was there and happened to bump into one of the producers and just said, I really love this program. I think it's a great program. It wasn't broadcast south of the border at the time. It was exclusively a Scottish production and for broadcast and digestion in Scotland. And I just said to them, look, I'm not pitching for anything. I just think it's a really great program, and it's a real, in a way, it's the antithesis of Gardener's World, which is much more aspirational. Yes. Whereas Beechgrove is much more realistic, and it's much more similar to the conversations you would have down at the allotment than perhaps something like Gardener's World. They are two very different products.
Yes.
And I just said I think it's great, and really enjoy the relaxed approach to the way that you put the information across. And then some while later they contacted me and said, well, the BBC is looking for new programs with a sort of broadening of the BBC platform and iPlayer and all those sorts of things. They wanted more content, and so the BBC centrally was looking out to the regions to see what programs they could broadcast across network that were just previously regional, and they decided that Beechgrove could be broadcast on network. But the simple truth is they felt that nobody would quite understand the Aberdeen accent, so they wanted they wanted a token Englishman on it to make it kind of palatable for anybody south of the border. So I think I am the token Englishman on Beechgrove to make it palatable to anyone who lives south of the border. But what's interesting is that where I am, as I said earlier, I'm 900 feet or so up, and really exposed. And before lockdown, I would travel up to Aberdeen, relatively frequently and do a day's filming and so on. And when I left home, if my daffodils were in flower, when I got to Aberdeen, the daffodils were in flower. The nature of that garden and the fact that that's the kind of dry east coast where the temperature is quite ameliorated, not actually that dissimilar in terms of the order of flowering of plants. So that nervousness that the BBC had about relevance of the programme, it's a gardening programme for Scotland, and therefore it won't apply to anyone in southern England because clearly the climate's very different, was absolutely proved to be wrong. What is true is that if you have altitude, then of course that is in a way forcing the situation much more towards a northerly position. And so, the Cotswolds, where I am, is actually very similar from a cropping perspective as Aberdeen on the east coast. So I think it has much more relevance to people than perhaps was initially envisaged, which is great. But it's a lovely program to be part of. Yeah.
Last question: will there be any more Flying Gardener, Chris? You and your helicopter.
Gosh, that's going back a bit. When did we last film a Flying Gardener? That must be 20 years ago, I should think. Would that be 20?
Oh, yeah. Probably, yeah, probably would be. Yeah, maybe. Probably late 90s, early 2000s.
Yeah, but it probably would be.
You're a slip of a lad. I remember that.
I know. Yeah, straight out. Well, actually, I was teaching at the time. I was lecturing, and I got the gig because
in true BBC fashion, the then controller of BBC Two apparently was flying back from Manchester to London in the BBC helicopter, because the BBC apparently had its own helicopter. And she looked out the window and looked down at the pattern of gardens and just said, oh, there must be a program in that. So she contacted one of the exec producers to develop a format. And so I was lecturing at Pershore College. And in fact, I was sitting outside having my lunch, and my phone rang, and this person said, you don't know who I am, but we've been passed your name. Can I just ask you a few questions? And I said, yeah, of course, that's fine. And so she said, how do you feel about flying? And I said, well, I don't mind flying. It's fine. I'm not a pilot, but I enjoy flying. Yeah. And she said, well, do you know, what do you know about the landscape? And I said, well, look, I teach landscape history. I'm a landscape designer and I teach landscape history. So she said, oh, that's great, ticking the boxes. Yeah. And the third question was, are you available? And it just so happens I was available. So I went down and sat with them as they were developing this sort of program. And when I went into the meeting room, they said, so we've got this idea. There's going to be a helicopter, and you're going to take off and you're going to fly around, and we need you to say something about landscape and gardens. And there was a pause, and I said, right, what else? And they said, no, that's it. That's the format. So what do you want to say? And so in trying to teach students about what plants to choose and where to plant them and how to plant them, I'd been very much inspired by some of the older writings, and sort of the arts and crafts approach of, right plant, right place is probably how we would now term it. But looking at nature for inspiration in terms of plant communities and plant position and environmental factors and so on. And I just said to them, look, you could fly around the landscape and you can spot wetlands, you can spot, because of the verdancy of the ground, particular vegetation types and leading to soil types and fertility, and look at woodlands and the sparseness of the canopies, etc. And that will give you a very good idea as to what you should be doing in your garden. And as soon as we started to explore that, they said, okay, that's it. That's what we need to do. And so Flying Gardener was born out of that. It was a kind of somewhat whimsical conversation. And just that idea that I said, look to nature, because nature will tell you everything you need to know about growing plants.
I enjoyed that, and on a similar theme, where they put Christine in a hot air balloon, didn't they, to view gardens as well? A similar thing, but they were really enjoyable things, because it's not a normal way to view a garden, quite simply, and it leads different things, and as you understand how, going back hundreds of years, how landscape designers, from your Capability Browns to your Gertrude Jekyll's, how they maybe viewed things in a different way. Although they couldn't physically obviously fly in a helicopter, they could hot air balloon. I think it gives you a wonderful way to think that they're thinking often on very many levels as such, not just ground view. What's it going to look like? And the big stately home, well, you're going to be 30, 40 feet in the air if you're looking from the top window type thing. And I think it's a wonderful learning experience, that how it's not just about, you have to be thinking on multiple levels at all times. I know when I've chatted to Mark Lane, obviously he's in a wheelchair, and he said he hasn't always been in his wheelchair, but he says the different aspects you have to see from being an able-bodied to non-able-bodied gives you another unique perspective, in his case, a unique perspective to see actually all the slightly different things. And I think you, like you said earlier, you're always learning on those things, and it's a wonderful thing to do.
Yeah, well, I think that I'd forgotten actually that Christine had gone up in a hot air balloon, but I think to answer your question about will there ever be another Flying Gardener, I think that the hot air balloon was probably as close as the BBC will permit themselves to go with it. I think that the nervousness over being accused of having a large carbon footprint flying a helicopter around for entertainment probably is paid to any reoccurrence of anything like Flying Gardener. But they did contact me subsequently to say, is there anything else that we can do? Is there something we can do in terms of the running gardener, or something that's a little bit more eco and less carbon footprint? But as you quite rightly say, the joy of that particular program was being able to be elevated and see the connectivity of the landscape and see the consequences of
a spring meandering via a stream into an estuary and spilling out into the ocean, and all of those kind of connected habitats is what starts to join the dots in people's minds, and get the education angle across, and give them the confidence to have a go at planting the right range of plants. So I think it was a good format, and appealed. It was a very sexy machine to be flying around in. So that appealed to a certain audience. Some people were quite partial to Michael, the helicopter pilot, and there were a few gardeners watching as well. So it was, it sort of touched a lot of buttons, or pressed a lot of buttons, I think, in that respect.
Ticks all the boxes. That's probably someone at the BBC would say. Well, thanks very much for joining us, Chris. It's been wonderful to drop in on you and have a chat about all things nature as such, and I wish you good luck in the thing, and as you say, and I look forward to seeing a bit more of you on telly, maybe. There you go. Well, maybe not in the air.
Well, thank you, and if I can just to go back to Readly for a moment, if I can just, if anyone's looking for inspiration, looking for information, then point them in the direction of Readly/gardening, or actually it's readly.com/gardening, and you can access that particular digital platform with that plethora of gardening advice, because that it's not always possible for you or I to be on hand to hold people's hand, as it were. So if they can't get access to you or I, then they can have a browse through Readly and maybe pick up an article from Medwin or Alan or Monty or whoever it is.
No trouble. Well, thank you very much, Chris, and I say have a lovely weekend, and I hope the rain and wind doesn't batter you too much over the weekend.
Yeah, and you. Good to speak.
Cheers, lovely to speak to you. Bye now.
Bye-bye.
If you've enjoyed this video, press the like button, and also give us a comment, let us know what you're doing in the garden at the moment. And if you like our videos generally, it'd be really great if you'd subscribe to our YouTube channel.